Good evening, everybody. Everybody here in person and everybody online. My name is Elizabeth Simmons. I'm the Executive Vice Chancellor, the Chief Academic Officer of UC San Diego, and it is really a great pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 Ellsworth Lecture, which is one of the signature events of the 21st Century China Center right here at UC San Diego. And it's a highlight of UC San Diego's engagement with global policy and public service. We gather today to honor the legacy of Ambassador Robert, or Bob, Ellsworth, an extraordinary public servant whose leadership and foresight and dedication continue to inspire us. Bob was instrumental in the creation of the China Center, and his conviction that rigorous research and open dialogue are essential to sound policymaking continues to guide the center's mission even today. I think we could all agree that the U.S. China relationship is one of the most consequential bilateral relationships in the world. This year's lecture, delivered by Sarah Beran, comes at a key inflection point in that relationship. And its future really affects not only our two governments and our two peoples, but universities like ours and universities in China as well. Driving positive social change and social innovation is a key part of UC San Diego's mission. We're dedicated to developing global changemakers through education and research and community engagement on multiple levels. UC San Diego is home to a vibrant community of international scholars from China whose contributions to our university and the life of the university is truly essential to our academic and cultural excellence. And their presence reminds us every single day of the importance of engaging broadly with the world and the importance in particular of the U.S. China relationship. Even as international education here and around the world faces a series of unprecedented challenges. Well, leveraging our spirit of innovation and our culture of collaboration, we're strengthening efforts across academia and research institutions, government agencies, and community-based organizations to empower changemakers and to develop solutions to the challenges that all of us could name that are facing our global society. And the 21st Century China Center is truly at the forefront of these efforts. It's a leading hub for research, for dialogue, for policy engagement on U.S.-China relations, bringing together scholars and practitioners and the public to better understand amazingly important facets of our rapidly changing world. And its work has never mattered more than today. Campus programs like the Robert F. Ellsworth Lecture Series honor changemakers and also bring together experts from different fields to spark discoveries and to spark, hopefully, an inspiration in our students that will advance society. Today's lecturer mentioned having had the pleasure of spending time with our students today, and that's such an important feature, I think, of the lecture series. I want to acknowledge the friends and supporters who make all of this possible. The partnership and generosity of the Ellsworth family, Dr. Z.Y. Lee, the dedicated community around GPS and UC San Diego, and our many allies in the broader San Diego region sustain the center's mission in this time when global engagement is both more difficult and more essential than ever. And we truly, truly appreciate all of this generous and thoughtful support. So thank you again for being here today and for your ongoing commitment to the work we do and to this kind of intellectual engagement and conversation. Now it's my great pleasure to invite my colleague, Professor Victor Shi, the director of the 21st Century China Center, to the podium. Victor?
Yeah, at this point, I think we want to have Eleanor and then ZY Lee come up to share briefly their memory and tribute to Bob. Do you want? Okay, yeah. Why don't you go first? Yeah.
Dear Eleanor and friends, ladies and gentlemen, it has been my honor and pleasure to sponsor the Ellsworth Lecture ever since its inauguration. It was a very different China and the United States then from now. And I'm sure a decade from now, it will be a very different China and the United States. And Bob Ellsworth has the wisdom and the foresight to urge its attention on the evolving landscape of Sino-China relationship. And I look forward to Sarah's perspective in its coming remarks. Thank you all. Thank you, Victor.
I have the best job in town tonight. I get to thank everybody. Thank everyone for coming, for being part of this audience, and I especially want to thank ZY for his sponsorship over the years, but even more than that, our friendship. And I never would have known you had it not been for Bob and you two getting together and making some good music, and it's really wonderful. I want to thank all of those here in the school, too, who have put forth all the efforts, not only for tonight, but always. It's so thrilling, even though I don't live here anymore. I read what's happening here, and I'm really impressed. And I know if Bob were here, he would be rah-rah here for everybody and really be so gratified that this lecture series is happening. So enjoy tonight. I know that we're going to learn a great deal. Sarah, where'd you go? There you are. And I'm so glad to meet you today. So again, thank you so much.
So it really is truly my distinct pleasure to welcome the speaker of tonight. By the way, for the 21st Century China Center, in which I'm a director, the Ellsworth Memorial Lecture really is one of the most important events we have on an annual basis. And I really, in recent memory, I can't think of a more appropriate speaker than our speaker tonight, Sarah Beran, who hails from the great state of Washington, but is a career diplomat who served in the U.S. government for over 23 years. Most recently, he was a charge d'affaires in the Beijing Embassy of the United States, but just previous to that, he was in charge of China and Taiwan affairs in the National Security Council. Previous to that, she served in a number of very distinguished positions in the U.S. government, including as former Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's Deputy Executive Secretary for Indo-Pacific, as well as former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's Director of the Office of Chinese and Mongolian Affairs. And now, after government service, she's a partner in macro advisory, as well as a non-resident fellow at the 21st Century China Center. So we're very happy to have her on the team. With that, please join me in welcoming Sarah to the podium.
Good evening. It is so good to be here today on the West, and I have to say best coast. It took me a while to get back. Thank you, Victor, for your kind introduction. It is such an important topic that we have before us today. When Susan, Victor, and Lei first approached me about this lecture several months ago, the trajectory of the U.S. China relationship seemed uncertain. Tensions had dramatically spiked, and subsided several times since Trump administration took office. Embargo-level tariffs following April's Liberation Day gave way to midsummer stabilization and wishful speculation about a grand bargain. Tensions rapidly again escalated in September, and then a meeting between Presidents Trump and Xi ushered in an uncertain, and I would argue temporary, truce. The path forward looks to be just as volatile, and so it is useful that today's lecture gives us the space to explore different possibilities, 3 different possible futures for the relationship, and the structural and idiosyncratic elements that might influence this trajectory. A year ago, there was a bipartisan consensus in Washington on the nature of the threat China posed to U.S. national security, although opinions vary greatly on how to counter that threat and the elements of national power to use. Now, less than a year later, this consensus has been questioned, and the lattice work of partners to deal with the China challenge has been set aside in favor of a G2 approach. Some are cheering this change, worried that the 2 superpowers were locked into a path that would lead inexorably to conflict. Others are deeply concerned that focusing solely on economic challenges in the relationship will weaken deterrence and increase longer-term risk in the relationship. But for the first time in years, as the U.S. China relationship bounces around like an EKG, this moment of tumult and volatility makes it seem like anything is possible. And so it truly is useful to explore the different factors and possibilities ahead of us. Today, we'll talk about 3 possible futures from least to most likely. First, a grand bargain that sets the bilateral relationship on a more stable trajectory. Second, a rapid deterioration of bilateral ties that could lead to economic and perhaps even military conflict. And finally, persistent strategic competition across economic, technological, and military domains that is short of conflict, but results in selective decoupling. As any student of international relations, and I know we have many of them here today, will tell you, structural dynamics are incredibly important in charting the course of a bilateral relationship. But I will not use our time today to repeat the well-known debates over rising and status quo powers. We're familiar with the Thucydides trap and the challenges presented in that. As a practitioner who has had a ringside seat to U.S. China diplomacy for the last 25 years, I will focus instead on the idiosyncratic elements that can have an equally important and critical impact on the relationship's trajectory. First, Beijing has agency in the direction of the relationship to a greater degree than we have ever seen before. It has always had a veto on U.S. efforts to change the trajectory of the relationship, but we are seeing something different now. Beijing is shaping policy and acting preemptively, not just mirroring U.S. actions in proportional retaliation, as was the case during the first Trump administration, informed at least in part by what it sees as its success in forcing the Trump administration to climb down twice from the threat of tariffs in April and October. China now views itself as an equal to the United States, as Defense Minister Dong Jun reportedly told his counterpart, Secretary of War Hegseth. This will have implications far beyond just trade negotiations. Second, the personalities and idiosyncrasies of leaders matter, more than observers outside the system realize. I could tell you funny stories from across the world on how personalities matter, but cognizant of some of the sensitivities there. Instead, I will just tell you that it is more important sometimes than even strategy. They inject an element of uncertainty and possibility into a relationship. Leaders can hit it off, and it can put the relationship on a fundamentally different trajectory. I saw this dynamic firsthand with the strengthening of the U.S.-India relationship, for example. The affinity between Indian Foreign Secretary Jaishankar and his counterparts on the U.S. side, they genuinely liked and trusted him. They enjoyed spending time with him. This led both sides to take greater risks in their respective politics. While trust and affection is in short supply between the U.S. and China, the interpersonal dynamic has changed how Beijing deals with the White House. Rightly or wrongly, Beijing believes elevating all issues to the top will mean a more favorable hearing for its position. This is a significant deviation from the previous strategy of trying to shape U.S. policy from the bottom up. Third, the maxim that all politics are local applies to foreign policy, and it is even more true in an era of social media and the internet. Presidents watch inflation, consumer sentiment, and yes, the bond market, shifting approaches unpredictably on foreign policy issues as a result. President Biden held off on sanctioning Russia's energy sector in a meaningful way over concern about prices at the pump during an election year, leading Moscow to doubt his stomach for tougher measures. This White House backed away from doubling tariffs on China over concern about rising bond yields, when in the context of trade negotiations, it should have shown strength and held firm. And while the centralized nature of the Chinese system means Chinese leaders are much less responsive to the concerns of their citizens, they still exhibit a surprising degree of sensitivity to staying on the right side of vocal netizens. These domestically driven shifts are often misread by foreign counterparts as giving them greater leverage than they actually have. Very rarely does a counterpart understand the domestic politics of the other to a degree that they can calibrate strategic advantage. Instead, it can lead to miscalculation or overconfidence in leverage. Fourth, neither the US nor the Chinese system operates as a monolith, and major decisions often emerge from internal bureaucratic competition between institutions, factions, and worldviews. In the United States, there is a visible tension now between those who favor a more hawkish posture on China and those who approach China through a transactional deal-making lens. The lack of consensus and no central policy coordination mechanism leads to contradictory and sometimes incoherent public messaging and even policy. And in China, unclear leadership guidance and competing bureaucratic interests and priorities drive competing approaches, even if public talking points can suggest unity. So with these considerations about agency, personality, domestic politics, and bureaucratic fragmentation in mind, let's move on to the three possibilities for the bilateral relationship, what would need to happen to bring each to pass, and how these paths could be sustained. We'll start with what I consider to be the least likely scenario. And that is, in my view, the grand bargain. The United States and China reach agreement on a broad swath of issues that puts the relationship on a more stable and positive trajectory. Not a reversion to the full engagement of the early 2000s, for that is impossible in the current times, but at least a less toxic version of competition. In the economic domain, this would require an accommodation on some structural economic issues to avoid a second China shock, which would make a grand bargain untenable domestically in the United States. And both countries would need to press pause on the drive to rip the other out of AI and tech stacks. Some de-risking would be acceptable, but not a wholesale decoupling in today's economy. In the military domain, the two sides would need to reach an understanding on Taiwan. Norms and guardrails would need to be established around militaries operating in close proximity, and on cyber activities such as data theft and pre-positioning on civilian critical infrastructure. If a grand bargain were exclusively scoped around economic issues, that is, the two sides did not reach agreement or did not even discuss strategic issues, then to be sustainable, it would require the US retreating to a Western Hemisphere-centric sphere of influence, reducing its presence in Asia, acquiescing in China's political strategy towards Taiwan, making clear to its Asian allies that mutual defense treaties no longer applied, and accepting a multipolar world and essentially a unipolar Asia. I say this because unless that withdrawal happens, the tensions that erupt in the relationship would make a grand bargain unsustainable. Beijing, in turn, would need to accept those spheres of influence, reduce its presence in the Western Hemisphere, stepping back from port and infrastructure deals in the region, changing its rhetoric around global governance, and reducing at least the scale and scope of its vast cyber operations against the United States. Again, in order to be sustainable, a grand bargain would take both stepping back. My view is that this kind of grand bargain is highly unlikely. even though this may be where the White House or some in the White House would like to go. When the U.S. and China normalized relations in 1979, the last time there was really a grand bargain, it was motivated by a shared desire to shift the strategic balance with the Soviet Union. The compromises that were required on both sides were possible because of the shared strategic goal. I see no evidence that there is a common threat or a common shared strategic goal. In fact, it is the opposite. Beijing is convinced that the current administration is an anomaly, and the long-term U.S. goal will remain containment and decoupling. It is confident of its growing leverage, sees the U.S. negotiating from what it believes is a position of weakness, and believes that over time the position will continue to weaken. Beijing is therefore unwilling to take the actions needed, and the U.S. again is unable to sustain a grand bargain alone. This brings us to the second scenario, slightly more likely in the longer term, but still not the baseline scenario. Rapid deterioration of the bilateral relationship, decoupling, and potentially even conflict between the United States and China. In the short term, this is very low probability, but high impact for obviously the US, China, and the world. The downside risks, economic, social, and military, mean neither side is likely to deliberately choose this path. But over time, if military operations, cyber activities, and deployment of economic chokeholds continue unabated, with both sides aiming to increase the leverage that they have on the other, it will feed a continuation of competition and decoupling that will never reach the point of stability. And when the two economies and the two peoples have few remaining ties and multiple friction points, the potential for a rapid deterioration becomes much more likely. This rapid deterioration or break in relations could be preceded by what the Chinese like to say, and I think we have adopted, a black swan event, compounded by miscommunication, disinformation, and misread signaling. This could be a metal-on-metal incident in the South China Sea, that is, our two planes or two ships colliding, or in the Taiwan Strait that escalates into a limited conflict or standoff. It could be a domestic cyber attack that destroys civilian critical infrastructure and lives. Incidents like these would likely prompt a cutoff in communication between the two sides for a time. The three recent black swan events that I count, the US bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, the Chinese downing of the US EP-3 in 2001, and the Chinese spy balloon over the United States in 2023, all very difficult to predict, resulted in diplomatic blackouts, derailing of the bilateral relationship, and a freeze in crisis communications. Now this, at the time, these three incidents, the cutoff was brief. It did not last. But the dynamics are different now. China is more confident. The channels are thinner. They're fewer in number, less deep. And social media in both countries can fan the flames of populism much more quickly. A miscommunication or misreading of the signals fed by disinformation or even a disruptive state actor like Russia, that an incident was a prelude to an action related to Taiwan, could prompt a reaction. Both sides view a destructive cyber attack, for example, on civilian critical infrastructure as a prelude to military action, that it would only be used in the immediate phase before an attack. But what if such a cyber attack were launched by AI? As Anthropic alleged a recent low-grade Chinese cyber espionage campaign was. What if diplomatic channels went dark, leaving no avenue for de-escalation or crisis management? The aggrieved party could launch a counterattack, as US officials have explicitly warned China in the past. This rapid escalation, while seemingly the stuff of action films, is a plausible outcome in a future where prolonged and unmanaged competition has led to decoupling. Which leads us to the third and slightly less dark option, and luckily the one that I think is most likely. Inertia is a powerful force in foreign policy, and the third and most likely scenario is a continuation of strategic competition. It does not preclude tactical truces. In fact, this is a likely component, as we saw last month in the meeting between the two presidents in Korea. Both sides see value in a temporary stabilization to minimize the economic impact of decoupling in some strategic sectors and allow both sides to focus on their own domestic issues. In the economic domain, there would be fierce competition, trade barriers, and some trade and investment in non-sensitive sectors, even as both sides seek to rationalize and reduce their economic dependence on each other. In military and cyber domains, both sides would continue operations, but military deterrence, the threat of punitive economic actions, such as sanctions, and strong alliances on the US side would discourage further escalation. But how stable is this status quo? And can it be sustained on the back of trade talks alone? Chinese scholars have argued that strategic competition could be a phase, a temporary transition towards a new equilibrium of a cooler but more stable relationship. This is an attractive framing. But finding a new equilibrium would require the US accepting China as a peer equal, with both sides taking steps to curb the most aggressive military and cyber activities, both sides acquiescing in the reality that they will deny each other the most advanced technology, and leaders on both sides exerting control over the most hawkish voices in their systems. That is a long list of requirements for a relationship that lacks the most basic elements of trust. It is not impossible, but it would require a negotiated, coordinated pullback from the more extreme elements of strategic competition, not just a tactical standoff between two peer equals. The rumored pause on national security measures by both sides following the Trump-Xi meeting last month could be the start of this pullback. But instead, I find it far more likely that it is just a tactical truce, giving both sides, again, breathing room before the next round of escalation. As we weigh these three scenarios, where are we confident, what are we missing, and where is our bias? Sharp differences in how Beijing and Washington, Financial Street and Wall Street answer these questions mean that there are very different visions of the future and relative risk. The relationship has shown more resilience than originally expected over the last 8 years since strategic competition intensified. I remember in the beginning the predictions of a rapid deterioration, and that was proven wrong. Both sides can take some tension in the relationship. But it has also exhibited a nearly uninterrupted structural decline, and it is unclear to me where that decline will end. Rising Chinese confidence and risk tolerance mean we are in uncharted territory, and previous reaction cycles may not be predictive of future action-reaction cycles. And Washington is also far from a predictable actor, with fraying alliances and no consensus internally on the approach to China. Absent concerted effort on both sides, over time, unfettered strategic competition could lead to a bifurcated, less stable, and more conflict-prone world. A far preferable outcome would be a stable, managed competition, with selective decoupling again in some national security-sensitive areas, but continued trade and investment in others. But that is only possible with intense diplomacy that places limits on that decoupling and introduces norms around behavior and coordination with partners and allies on a joint approach. And finally, a strategy here in the United States that rebuilds core American strengths. So with that, thank you very much for your time. Mrs. Ellsworth, thank you for the lecture this evening.
So I think now we're gonna have a few minutes of just a moderated discussion, followed by Q&A from the audience, including online audience. Please use the Q&A function on Zoom to ask your questions. And I think usually Harry is the voice of the internet. Yes, so we're looking out for your hands, Harry. So I think you present a very interesting kind of three futures for U.S.-China relations. But I guess for me, it's still, whether that's kind of like a stable equilibrium. And that's, at a time when there's big changes in how the US makes policy, and also the economic balance between China. It's really not about China and the U.S. anymore. It's really China compared to the rest of the world. That is also rapidly changing. I mean, China's export to the rest of the world is growing yet again by leaps and bounds. It's one potential, so one of your scenarios like a grand bargain, but is part of that almost like a forced grand bargain where not just the US, but other major industrial powers around the world, they just come to realize that China is so dominant economically that in the absence of any US leadership, they sort of have to bow down to Chinese economic might. I mean, do you think that's at all possible, or do you think there's some underlying factor that would prevent that from happening?
It's a good question. I think I have a mic here. Thank you. What you're essentially asking is, does the US decouple from China, but the rest of the world remains coupled? And so what we are actually doing in the United States is decoupling from the rest of the world, standing on our own in a type of autarky. I think in parts of trade and investment, parts of the economy, that may happen, whether we like it or not. And I look in particular at the spread, and folks in the audience may know this better than I, but Chinese large language models. Not the big AGI, but rather the app-type version that is being integrated into almost every type of technology and good. And what I am seeing is that it is being adopted at a fairly rapid rate, even by US companies. The low cost, the capabilities mean that it is just a good investment decision. And so in some areas, it may be the US, and by that I mean the US government pulling back, but the rest of the world moves on. However, I don't think it is realistic to expect that the China issue disappears from the plate of other world leaders. And the reason for that is most countries, most leaders have a lived experience with Chinese behavior. Look at what is happening between Japan and China right now. This is not just a U.S. China issue, right? It is about China's behavior with the rest of the world. And I think we could dive into it in the Q&A period if there's interest, but China's cutting off seafood, films, potentially rare earths, shutting down travel between Japan and China in a concerted effort to put pressure on the new Japanese prime minister and force policy changes. Japan is not the only one to have felt this. It happened against Korea in 2017 with the deployment of missile batteries on the peninsula aimed at protecting Korea from North Korea. It has happened against the Philippines, against Norway, against parts of the EU. There is a lived experience with the Chinese toolkit of economic statecraft. And in fact, I think China's deployment of the rare earth export controls, while it forced a US back down, also is going to promote decoupling from European companies, Japanese companies, Australian companies out of the rare earth supply chain. So it's not just as easy as saying if the US doesn't change its behavior, there's a decoupling with the US and the world. I think there's a very lived experience with Chinese economic coercion throughout the world.
Yeah, so in other words, countries, they have their own sort of political incentives.
That's right.
to, in a sense, have some alternatives to the Chinese stack, if you will, industrial stack. And because you have overseen sort of Taiwan affairs, in different stages of your career, so I'm going to ask you a Taiwan question. One thing that has really struck me in recent years as I go to Asia is that, everyone asks me, it's like, Professor Xu, when is it going to happen? I'm like, what do you mean it? It's like, when is China going to invade? There's no longer this question, it's like, oh, well, maybe it won't happen and stuff. Like everyone across the straits, like just sort of assume it will happen. I am not so pessimistic. In your opinion, what is the best path forward to avoid it from happening, which is a military scenario from developing across the Taiwan Straits?
When to sell your TSMC stock is what you're asking me. Just teasing all in the audience. Look, I think we tend to oversimplify sometimes the binary nature of choices ahead of us, or ahead of China in the world. I think what is clear is that Xi Jinping's strategic objective is reunification of the mainland with Taiwan. There is no doubt in my mind of that objective. However, the timeline is not set. Military invasion would be the last of a very long list of choices, I think, before him. The conflation, I think, of the year 2027 in particular was, I think, almost an oversimplification of the choices that we have in front of us. Instead, it is a timeline for professionalization of the military, right, and readiness. It is not about this is the go, no-go date of an invasion. I think we are far more likely to see in the period ahead a somewhat potentially tampering down of military tensions, and I think we're already seeing that, where essentially it's almost a restraint for restraint approach. Trump has dialed back some of the language on Taiwan, some of the more overt messages of support, and in return we're seeing a slight decreased public emphasis on military measures by China. But instead, what is ramping up is disinformation, political pressure, potentially political interference in Taiwan elections, economic coercion, all the other tools of choice that Beijing would prefer to use to achieve what its strategic objective is. And so I see now this period of testing where in the statements that the Chinese Foreign Ministry made just last week, they are trying to now push Taiwan out of APEC, of which it has been a member for decades. How will the U.S. respond? What will be the effect of that push out? And if it is successful, I think Beijing will be emboldened to continue that track. I think you'll see attempted political interference in the Taiwan presidential election in 2028. And that really, I think, is the inflection point. If DPP wins again, I am concerned that there will be a ramp up in military tensions. That is also, of course, the U.S. transition year as well. And I think it is possible Beijing could see that as an opportunity when there is a gap in U.S. focus and leadership. I am not predicting that is the year it happens, far from it. But I think that will be the next inflection point. So from now to 2028, an enhancement of all these coercive measures. And then 2028, depending on what happens in the Taiwan election, potentially another inflection point and another stage of increased pressure on Taiwan.
No, but even if the DPP, and actually there's crazy conspiracies that I heard in Taiwan, I'll share with you over dinner. Like this very crazy, but then after a while, I don't think it's so crazy after all. So there's this inflection point, but like, is there anything, even if the DPP were to get reelected, is there anything they can do to delay the timeline perhaps indefinitely by making some kind of concessions?
I think in this space, concessions tend to embolden a Chinese action. So instead, I can't speak to this administration's posture, but certainly under the Biden administration, the focus was trying to push out that timeline and the date which Xi Jinping would wake up and feel comfortable making the decision go, no go. So do everything you can to create doubt, to ensure that Taiwan has a self-defense capability, that partners and allies have expressed concern about peace and stability across the strait, the impact that everyone, Beijing, Taipei, the rest of the world is clear about the impact that such a conflict would have on global growth, right? It would be devastating trade that flows through that region. So the goal had always been push out that timeline, focus on deterrence, and I think that is the best you do on an issue like this. You manage it, you don't solve it.
Great. Let's open it up to audience questions. Raise your hand. Yes, yeah. Over there.
China, good evening. China has a population of 1.5 billion people. Is it fair to say that China is a world unto themselves and really doesn't need the rest of the world? It doesn't need Taiwan, doesn't need Japan, doesn't need Korea. Is there another possibility where, like we in the United States, when you look at the United States, we really never have gotten involved with Mexico, Central America, or South America for, is it possible that that the political leadership in China may say, hey, We can do this all on our own, and we don't need to expand in Asia. Your thoughts? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I think parts of the Chinese system are probably arguing exactly that. And you see elements of it right now through, I'll lapse into China nerd mode, if you don't mind, through those planning documents, the fourth plenum statements that came out just earlier this month, and the 5-year plan, this focus intense on self-reliance, on diversification away from the United States, on strengthening industry domestically. And I think the goal here is to create a self-contained economic entity that doesn't need anyone else. But the reality is that is far from what China is right now. It is dependent on export markets. And even as it has reduced reliance on the U.S. export market, it has increased exports to Europe, to Southeast Asia, to Latin America, to Africa, because the nature of its system, the supply-demand curves just don't meet. Their just supply continues pumping out, and they need to be able to sell that somewhere. And so export markets are absolutely critical.
Could you comment on how the internal situations in China and the various aspects of, unemployment, their economy, the real estate market, and all of that, how that is going to have an impact on how China would act externally, whether to the U.S. or with respect to Taiwan?
That's a really good question. And I think what we're seeing now in Beijing's desire for stability in the relationship now, and even throughout the Biden administration, is reflective of the immense domestic pressures they have. And I think the leadership would prefer to have a calm external environment so they can really focus in on these tough domestic issues. There are no easy answers. The economy is in a structural slowdown. The drivers of growth, particularly household consumption, just is not recovering from the property slowdown. There are still very bright spots in the economy. I don't mean to be too negative. And in fact, I think you could argue the same in the US. It's a bit of a K-shaped economy where you have the high-tech, innovative sectors just doing tremendously well, and then the rest of the economy. And China, I think its leaders are really focused on how you address those very deep issues. Youth unemployment is very, very high. There's a mismatch of skill sets. I mean, in many ways, we mirror each other, I think, sometimes in the economic problems we face, even despite the differences in our system. So I think the fact that there are such heavy problems at home does create a desire for stability. However, I think an external enemy can be quite helpful to create a rally around the flag effect. And in fact, we saw elements of this through the summer as I think Chinese propaganda sought to blame all problems in the economic sphere on tariffs in the United States, when in fact, so many of them were rooted in the structural model. So I think there is the potential that it could create some vectors of instability over time as well. Yes, exactly.
We've got a bunch of good questions from online, so I'll give you 3 and then you can answer them as you see fit. First, from Jim Kralik, can you elaborate more on what steps both countries can take to best manage your option 3, including what institutions such as UCSD and individuals can do to be constructive vis-a-vis this critically important relationship? And then 2, where do you see AI companies like NVIDIA standing in Chinese-US relations? Additionally, with Chinese technology being so ingrained in everyday technology, what could be the effects of the pessimistic scenario you talked about on the everyday lives of citizens? And then 3rd, from Karis Templeman, Xi is in his 70s and won't be the core leader forever, and there's no obvious successor. How do you expect the struggle over succession to impact U.S.-China relations? Will it make one of your 3 paths more likely? Sorry, those are 3 very different areas, but...
Those are, and remind me if I forget to answer any of them. On the first one, Jim, I'm sorry we're missing you tonight. It's good to see you online. I think, look, I believe the work that institutions like UCSD does, the Track 2 dialogues, the people-to-people piece is incredibly important and more so than ever. You have to do it with eyes wide open, right? But keeping that people-to-people contact alive and well is really the only thing we have going at this point. I think of it almost as like keeping the light on in the ship as it drives through the storm, as it sails through the storm. And so really encourage you to keep up the dialogue and the academic level. Students going in both directions is incredibly important. We need to be able to understand our two countries. We need people in the U.S. government that understand China, and we need people in the Chinese government that understand the United States. Otherwise, I think the risk for miscalculation is quite high. So plenty to do in the non-governmental space. I think it is also absolutely critical that we find a way to thicken the diplomacy. And by that, I mean it cannot just be leader to leader. That is not enough. Both systems need to hear in stereo what the risks are, what the mechanisms are for crisis management. I was heartened to see it appears that there are still good military to military channels functioning, and that is important, but it needs to be more than episodic. So not a wholesale return to engagement of the previous decades, but a regular dialogue of some kind between, for example, the foreign minister and his U.S. counterpart. I've helped set up and sat in the meetings between then National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Wang Yi, and that was an absolutely critical channel, not to solve the problems, to manage them. And I don't see anything like that right now. The meeting between President Trump and President Xi lasted 90 minutes. When you have two leaders speaking and interpretation, that is an incredibly short time. You cannot cover the depth of the issues that you need to, that the two countries are facing. Okay, that was question one, and I'm going too long, but I'll go to question three, which was AI. No, succession, okay. Look, there are probably people in this space that know this issue better than I. I will just say it's an extremely black box about what the leadership is thinking in this. I think it will be important to watch in the next party Congress signals that there is some sort of plan, that there maybe is an advisory body or people elevated in the system. I think the leadership is going to be careful not to create a situation where there is a lame duck, where there's another person waiting in the wings and all of a sudden no one has to pay attention to the leader, to Xi, but instead, in the system, and I think the leadership thinks this as well, unless you have a succession plan, you have no legacy. And so I do think there will be a moment when we start to have a little more clarity. That doesn't mean Xi Jinping is leaving the scene anytime soon, but just that some elements might start to become a little more apparent. Remind me the one on AI.
It was how do AI companies matter for U.S.-China relations, and because tech is so interdependent, what are the effects of the pessimistic scenario on everyday U.S. citizens?
So the pessimistic scenario, total break in relations, everything breaks down, potential conflict. I mean, the costs are just tremendous for both of our countries and the rest of the world. I think the economic impact would be quite great. Even a limited conflict would cost lives in both countries. And so in my mind, that is something both sides need to work very, very hard to avoid. On AI, it is thread through every element of the economy now, and I think that will continue to be the case. I would like to see, and we had part of this in the last administration, some dialogue around safety and risk. And I know there's a balance between over-regulation and safety and risk, but I just, I worry if we enter this next technology, there is no discussion about the elements of safety and risk, we will be leaving the systems wide open, as we did with the internet and the cybersecurity, just gaping holes that now have created the espionage opportunities, the hacks, the theft of data. So we need something in place around norms and guardrails in AI.
Actually, I forgot, I neglected to ask you a very practical question for us at the university, which is recently all these visa regulations that come down the pipeline. Can you give us kind of a quick overview of what the U.S. government's thinking about that issue has been, even before Trump 2, there was some internal sort of thinking that led to already some kind of visa restrictions, these entities. And then, of course, more recently, some very crazy ideas, no Chinese students or no Communist Party members, et cetera, et cetera. Where does that all come from?
That is a good question. Luckily, I'm no longer a State Department official, so I can't defend or completely explain what is going on now. But I will say there are very real threat vectors here, having sat in the embassy and seen some of the information. And we have to be clear-eyed that this is not just the US acting aggressively. In fact, it is a defensive measure, and that unfortunately, the Chinese system and the Communist Party in particular uses private citizens to steal technology, to gain information, and as vectors of influence. And that is terribly unfortunate, and I wish it were not the case, but it means we do have to take some steps, particularly around military-sensitive technologies, to ensure they are protected. But I don't think that should affect nor decrease the vast number of students that are flowing here into the United States. And in fact, I was heartened to see, I think President Trump on several occasions has expressed support for Chinese students studying here. And I think that is a really important message from the top of our system to the Chinese system, that these students are welcome.
Hi, I guess this question is a little bit similar with the successor questions. So I'm glad you mentioned the timeline for 2028. So my question is, what about like 2027? Because 2027 is the year, not only the 100-year anniversary for the PLA, and also it is time to maybe another round for Xi's administration, or we have a new leader in China. So what are you thinking about the 2027?
I think that was always a target, and when it was interpreted as the deadline for an invasion, that was an incorrect interpretation. Certainly it is an anniversary and it is an important one, but there are many ways I think the leadership can interpret forward progress on the goal of eventual reunification. It does not have to be military takeover. And so I think as we get a bit closer to 2027, it will be important to watch the messaging from Beijing and the central party organs about how it is defining those goals and shaping of public opinion around those goals. I want to be clear, I think the strategic goal remains the same, but we shouldn't be too tied to dates because I think that the leadership has shown flexibility in pushing those off and changing the definition of what success means.
What are your comments and the reflection on the almost holistic collapse of PLA top command on, say, near term 2027 and 5 years after, say, 2030 on Sino-China relationship?
It has been incredibly fascinating to watch what is happening with the PLA and the purges, for those that don't follow it as closely, the purges that are happening, the dismissals of just a vast part of the leadership, and then trickling down throughout the PLA as well. Many much more competent analysts than I have put forward theories. I think what I find most credible are two different aspects. One, there is a very real problem of corruption in the PLA. It is endemic. It is how everyone has been promoted. It is how people make money. And so there is no one that has completely clean hands. And I think she has set a goal of trying to root that out. The problem is, where does that end if the entire system is riven with it? And that is a very difficult challenge that I think will affect military readiness. The second element is why these top commanders, the CMC, the Central Military Commission leaders, He Weidong and Miao Hua in particular, were targeted, because they are apparently close to Xi. They're people that he brought in. I think the most credible explanation I have seen is that this is not about factionalism, pro-Xi and anti-Xi. Everyone is loyal to Xi. Instead, perhaps it is a factionalism below, perhaps between He Weidong and Zhang Youxia, the two CMC vice chairs. I have no idea if that is accurate, but it sounds credible to me in what I know of the Chinese system. Again, I do think there are very real military readiness components here, but I also think it introduces some volatility into the calculus, and that is new generals, new military leaders could be anxious to prove their loyalty it could lead to more aggressive exercises or action to show that they are ready, they are clean. And I think that is an element that we need to be careful of and keep an eye on.
Thanks very much for doing this. So, the European and Asian theaters are getting linked in a more complicated way. And the global South is about to face this wave of surplus capacity, which is coming from Chinese exports. And the risk of economic coercion is becoming, kind of more and more apparent, including through cyber. Is there a fourth possibility where China could face an external environment which actually is more hostile and sort of conforms with its view of a hostile environment, where risk assessment kind of shifts in the direction of a more hawkish American position globally, even if tacit?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The leadership, I think, is planning for a reversion to hawkish behavior on the US side. So that's kind of baked into the calculus. They believe that Europe will follow the United States in that essentially Europe is a policy taker, and whatever the US will ask, Europe will do. I don't know if that is accurate, but that is their view. And I think Beijing believes Japan will also follow in that more hawkish view. So I think they're planning for that array. I think where the leadership has placed its hope is on diversification away from those trading partners to the global South. And the question is, will that global South demand be enough in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia? That's unclear to me. There are, in some ways, very good things to be had from overcapacity in these markets. It means cheap goods, it means access to technology, it means cheaper energy. That's not all bad if you're sitting in the global South. And so there's a scenario where I could imagine some of that excess demand and that diversification is successful. But it will be challenging to just have those as the export markets. So the question I think we all have that is on the minds in Beijing and should be on our minds here is, how solid is that Europe, Japan, Australia, US coalition in the future? Are there real challenges to China's attempt to just ignore what that part of the world thinks and focus on the global South or not?
Squeeze in one more. Shopal?
Oh, hi. I have a question on Taiwan issue. For Taiwan, I think the current situation is the worst one that CPC could accept, which is that Xi Jinping or CPC always claims the sovereignty of Taiwan, but in fact, Taiwan and the mainland China is separated, and the young generations in Taiwan, that they don't have the sense of belonging of mainland, so they don't want to go back. I don't know if you agree with that, and my question is, if that's true, what's the worst condition or the situation that U.S. could accept on the Taiwan issue?
I do think it is accurate that it's difficult to imagine the Taiwan people changing their view of China's aggression, right? They have a very lived experience of what that feels like. They have seen what happened to Hong Kong, and I think that is very fresh on their minds. I think, though, that China is patient and will try to cultivate elements of the Taiwan political parties and try to use that to make governing very complicated for the DPP. It is not for the US to take a position on the status of China and Taiwan. What we have consistently said is that it needs to be peaceful, and that the two sides need to have a voice in what that looks like. But it is not the US's business to tell either side what their future should look like. So again, our focus is on peace and stability across the strait. We have focused and pressed for dialogue between the two sides, but not that they reach an agreement or that coercion is successful by any stretch of the imagination. I think it will be interesting to watch in the period ahead. My sense is that if President Trump travels to Beijing next year, China will want a discussion of Taiwan on the agenda. And so I, as an observer, will be watching carefully to see what the language President Trump uses and what signals that will send both to Beijing but to Taipei as well about U.S. position.
Great. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I mean, we could sit here and ask Sarah, dozens more questions. Thank you all for joining us. And please remember that we have one more event before the end of the year, which is December 4th, 4 p.m. Jeffrey Wasserstrom from UC Irvine is going to come and talk to us about his new book, The Milk Tea Alliance, which is on protest movements across Asia. But thank you very much, Sarah, for your excellent remarks and Q&A. And please join me in thanking her.
Thank you.